not going to get that far. You may be at the terminal rate already. You're definitely going to cause a recession. It'll be more severe than you think, and rates are going to have to come down sooner than people expect. In other words, you've already achieved the terminal rate. You just don't know it, and you'll probably be the last to know. So with Wall Street, with the cheerleaders, sending that message, but with some serious market indicators, including yield curves, sending that message. Why is Powell sticking to the game plan as I described it? And the answer goes back to 1980, believe it or not, and what's called the Volcker mistake.
Jim Rickards said something about the Volcker mistake and why Jerome Powell is still raising the interest rate and not cutting it yet. The famous Fed pivot, as Wall Street calls it. Jay Powell doesn't want to repeat the Volcker mistake by cutting the interest rates too early and failing to bring inflation down. Do you know why the interest rate was raised to 20% back in the 1980s? It's because of the Volcker mistake. The tale goes as follows: in the late 1970s, inflation was going up a lot and therefore the interest rates rose from around 4.5% to 10%. But that 5% raise took 3 years, from 1976 to 1979. Meanwhile, the current rate hike that we have now is the fastest in history. We went from 0 to 5.25% in just 1 year. Back in the 80s, we had a recession, and the chairman of the Fed, Paul Volcker, had to cut the interest rate down by 7%. Not 0.7%, but 7 full percentage points. He cut the interest rate from 17% to around 10%. And after that pivot, he raised it back to 20%, and 3 years later in 1987 the rates finally came back to normal. Back then, we needed 10 years in order to finally win the inflation fight. And now what? We're expecting it to win in a couple of months? The Fed just raised the rates fastest in history and people expect to bring it back down? Let's get into the detail.
People forget that there was a recession in 1980. It was sharp but quick. It was over very quickly. It had nothing to do with monetary policy. The Carter administration issued some dopey regulation on a ceiling on credit card interest rates. And the industry said, fine, we're just not going to lend anybody any money. The economy fell instantly, kind of like a smaller version of what happened in 2020 with the pandemic panic. And then they said, oh, sorry, just kidding. And then they took the ceiling off and then things got back to normal. Now, this was a time when farmers around the country were driving front loaders and tractors to Washington, and they were circling the Fed building. And one guy drove his tractor up the steps of the Fed, and Volcker was being burned in effigy. That all happened. So it was a little bit of pressure. And of course, Congress was up in arms and the White House was up in arms. So Volcker, not quite panicked, but he cut interest rates 7 percentage points, not 0.7, 7 full percentage points to deal with the recession, which, number one, was unnecessary because the recession was caused by a policy blunder from the White House, which was quickly corrected. And number two, he had not won the fight against inflation. Well, after he cut rates and we came out of that very quick sort of snap recession, inflation got even worse. And that's when Volcker had to raise rates to 20%. And Volcker, in hindsight, and he said this in his last book, just before he died, he said, we shouldn't have done that. We should have stuck to our inflation mission. So now Powell, remember, Powell's not an economist. He's a lawyer. So he kind of thinks like a lawyer. I can relate to that, looking at both sides. Powell does not want to be that guy. He does not want to be the guy who balks early and cuts rates, the famous Wall Street pivot, before the battle against inflation is won, because the outcome could be exactly what Volcker experienced, which is inflation wasn't done, doesn't go away, comes back stronger, and then you do have to destroy the economy, as we did in 1981-82. That was the worst recession. That was far worse than the little one in 1980. That was the worst since the Great Depression. We've managed to break that record several times since then, but at the time that was horrific. But Volcker and others have said that was a blunder. He never should have done. So Powell does not want to give up the rate hikes too early because he does not want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He does not want to be that guy. And that's what's driving him, even as Wall Street screams, you're already there. So the question is, that's the lay of the land. There's the two competing sides. How does this play out?
We learned a lot from Jim about the current situation and what Jerome Powell will be doing. But there's more to that story. Powell doesn't even understand what's going on in the real world, which is inflation itself. There are two sources of inflation, the supply side and the demand side. We are at the supply side inflation, which means the supply of goods is scarce but the demand is high and therefore the prices go up. But supply side inflation can transform into demand side inflation, and this is where the dangers begin. People's spending behavior changes and they're worried that something worse will happen, and then they grab everything they can, and therefore the demand rises, and you got yourself inflation caused by an increase in the demand side. That's what most people don't understand, including Wall Street. Wall Street said inflation will come down on its own because we've reached the terminal rate. But Jerome Powell thinks we are not done yet, and therefore he will raise rates even more. And what does Jim Rickards think? Does he think Powell is at the terminal rate yet?
In my view, Powell probably is there. He probably is at something like a terminal rate. He probably doesn't have to raise interest rates anymore. He doesn't believe that himself. His models tell him otherwise because they're relying on the Phillips curve, which is junk science. I mean, the last time I looked at a Phillips curve, it was flat. At least where I went to school, curve was curved. This thing is flat. There is no correlation between unemployment and inflation. There just isn't. But the Fed thinks there is. So I always tell people, don't. If you want to forecast Fed policy and understand the Fed, don't think like a rational person. You have to think like the Fed, because you have to get inside their heads or else you're going to get it wrong. So they're looking at unemployment, which is the lowest. The unemployment rate is the lowest since 1969. Well, if you believe in the Phillips curve, then that's a sure sign of inflation. As I say, even though it's coming down, it's still pretty high. So they think they have to keep fighting this fight. But here's what they're missing. Here's where it all falls down. Yeah, inflation as measured, CPI, PPI, personal consumption expenditure, core, non-core, year over year. There are like 20 different ways to measure it. It is coming down, but there are two sources of inflation, and it's going to sound obvious, but you got to separate them: the supply side and the demand side. They both result in price increases, but they have completely different dynamics. Supply side inflation is what we're seeing. It's what we saw in 1974 with the Arab oil embargo during the Arab-Israeli war when they cut us off from oil. And, you had to line up for gasoline. I lived through that. Bare shelves, and you couldn't get certain things. It wasn't that every supermarket shelf was bare the way it was in East Germany in the 1950s, but something was always missing. And that's still the case today. So, of course, prices went up, and people were trying to pay whatever they had to get what they needed, and energy prices were a big driver of that. So that feeds through as a form of inflation. The other kind of inflation is from the demand side. So the supply side is called cost push. Costs go up, and they push it onto the consumers. The other kind is from the demand side. It's called demand pull. And basically, consumers have a change in mentality. They're worried about inflation. They would say, hey, I was thinking about buying a refrigerator. Gee, I better go buy it today, because if I wait for 6 months, the price is going to go up. Or apply that to anything, a new dress, new suit of clothes, whatever. And so you're pulling demand forward, and it's behavioral. And that will also drive prices up. But they're very different things. Now, cost push can morph into demand pull. That's what happened in the 70s. It started from the supply side, but by the late 70s, 80s, and Volcker, which we've just been talking about, it had tipped over into the demand side. That hasn't happened yet. We've had the supply side inflation, the cost push. It hasn't yet tipped into demand pull. It hasn't really affected consumer behavior that much in terms of people anticipating more inflation. It could, but it hasn't happened yet. Here's why that's an important distinction. Cost push inflation negates itself. The old saying that the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices, because people can't afford it. Maybe if demand is inelastic, if you got to fill up your Ford F-150 truck with gasoline to take the kids to school or go to work. But if you're unemployed, you're not buying any gas because you're not leaving the house. So it tends to negate itself, whereas demand pull feeds on itself. Powell has not made that distinction. And if I'm right, I think I am right, and the evidence backs that up, this inflation will come down, not because the Fed is raising interest rates, but because higher prices destroy demand all on their own. If I used to pay $75 to fill up my truck with gas, and now I have to pay $150, which is about right, I'll do it because I got to get to work. But that's $75 I'm not going to spend on something else. I'm not going to go out for dinner. I'm not going to go to a show, a concert, or buy a new camera, whatever it might be. So it does tend to depress demand, destroy demand, and hurt the economy. And then it slows down, and then the inflation comes down on its own. That appears to be happening. But Powell hasn't really made the distinction. He's fighting the last war. I hate to use a cliche, but he's fighting the Volcker War. And what he's got looks a little bit more like the Herbert Hoover War. That looks a little bit more like the 1930s than the 1970s. So the bottom line on all this is the Fed is going to raise rates at least twice more for the reasons I mentioned. Powell doesn't want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He thinks the battle's not won. He has to get to the terminal rate. In reality, he's probably already there, if there is such a thing as a terminal rate. It's another one of these things they made up. Inflation is coming down, and so will probably continue, but for really bad reasons. In the U.S., we have a $100 bill. That's our largest denomination. When I was a teenager, the U.S. had a $500 bill, and they were in circulation. You could get them. So they eliminated that in 1968. No more $500 bill, and from then on, the $100 bill was the largest denomination. But the difference between then and now is that in 1968, a $100 bill was worth $100. If you adjust for inflation, the $100 bill of 1968 is worth about $20 in purchasing power in today's money. So we're already at a point where our largest denomination is worth $20 in purchasing power, at least compared to the 60s, $100 nominally, but it's greatly shrunk. So we don't have much cash. And by the way, if you want $1 million in $100 bills, it weighs exactly 22 pounds, and it fits in an attaché case, $1 million in $100 bills. People look at me funny. They go, Jim, how come you know that? Well, first of all, I do know that, but it's really just a math problem, because one bill, whether it's a 1 or 100, but I'm using hundreds because the biggest, weighs a gram. So it's basically 10 grams or 10 kilograms, 10 kilos, or 22.2 pounds. The point being, we're very far down the road to get them into cash anyway, but you can still do it. You can get your 22 pounds and have your $1 million in cash. So why are they so driven to eliminate cash? What's that got to do with central bank digital currency? Well, now we get into the purpose of the central bank digital currency. And the metaphor I've used is that if you want to slaughter pigs, you have to get all the pigs into a cattle chute and run them into the slaughterhouse and then slaughter them. You can't just let them, run around. You got to herd them up and get them into a cattle chute, or cows for that matter. And so if they want to slaughter savers and investors, they have to get you into a digital slaughterhouse. And that's what digital money is all about. If you can't have cash and you can only have the central bank digital currency, then everyone's got to have a digital account. And once they've got you in the system, of course, they know who you are because it's all digital, and they keep the ledger. Back to the ledger. What can they do? Well, they can impose negative interest rates. So you have $100,000 at 1% interest. You go away for a year, you come back, you should have $101,000. But with a negative interest rate of 1%, you go away, come back in a year, and you'd have $99,000. Well, cash is an easy way around that. At least you can bury it in your backyard, but at least you'd have the $100,000 in my example a year later. But with a digital account, they can actually take it out of your account. Number one. Number two, they can put a timestamp or an expiration date on your money and say, okay, here's your money that's in your account, but if you don't spend 10% of it in the next 30 days, we're going to impose a 2% penalty. We're going to take it away basically if you don't spend it. Oh, what does that do? It kind of forces you to spend it. Is that a kind of stimulus? Maybe, I'm not sure. These things don't usually work out as the eggheads plan, but the idea would be if we don't have enough what Keynes called aggregate demand, we'll force people to go buy stuff by telling them if you don't spend it, you lose it. Use it or lose it kind of thing. Okay. Withholding taxes. Now, again, in the United States, I think it's similar in Australia. If you have a job, quote unquote, your regular payday, whatever, they pay you, but they deduct the withholding tax at the source, and it's based on the rate. So maybe it's, 20%. So you make $1,000, they take out $200, and here's the $800 net to you. And then at the end of the year, they give you a statement, and you file your tax return, and you claim the withholding, and you reconcile your taxes. But that's not true for independent contractors, doctors, lawyers, professionals, writers, anyone who you earn a living, you work, right? But you don't have any withholding tax, but you still have the money still goes in your bank account. Well, now they can just impose the tax on your bank account. Say, well, hey, we see your inflows here. You make a nice living. We're going to take 20% of that. Again, we'll send you a receipt, tax receipt, and file your tax return and sort it out at the end of the year. That would come as a shock to a lot of doctors and lawyers. So negative interest rates and withholding taxes are two things that are hard to impose if in a world of cash and non-central bank digital currencies, but they're easy in a world of no cash and central bank digital currencies. Well, it gets worse. This is the culmination, just kind of cut to the chase. This is the culmination of the total surveillance state. We already have facial recognition software, very good. It's like your face is like a fingerprint. Everyone's a little different. You say, well, that's okay. I'm going to put a mask on because COVID, and sunglasses, and pull a hat down to my forehead. You'll never see my face. You know what? They have gait recognition software, GAIT, meaning how you walk. Everybody walks differently. It was it that Monty Python thing, the mystery of silly walks? Well, silly or not, everybody walks differently. And so they can actually digitally identify you just by the way you walk. And so your mask isn't going to help you. And with GPS, I have a bunch of what are called Faraday sacks. They're, some of them are nice, I'm glad they're wallets, but they're basically lined with a certain metallic fibers that block radiation. So if you want to turn your cell phone off, put it in a Faraday sack, and by the way, do the same with your Easy Pass and any other things sending out radiation, which are ubiquitous. Maybe they can't follow you around, but most people don't do that, and they do. And so with your iPhone, they know where you are at all times. You may be looking at a map trying to find a good restaurant, but they're tracking you. So they already do that. But now they take it a step further. So you're at the point of purchase, you're buying a book. Let's say it's a book that criticizes Kevin Rudd, for example. He's your leading panda hugger down in Australia, or in the United States, criticizes Joe Biden or something, or, Ultra MAGA handbook or whatever it is. Well, Ultra MAGA, you're an extremist, you're a radical, you're part of the insurrection. So now we're going to freeze your account or deny the purchase or put you on a watch list, or we just appropriated money to hire 87,000 armed IRS, Internal Revenue Service agents. Maybe we'll assign one to you because you bought the wrong book. So now we're into thought control. We're into basically subduing your political enemies because well, if you give money to a certain political candidate, again, perfectly legal stuff, buy a book, make a donation, that's legal. But they don't like who you're doing it with. And they meaning the government, they're watching. They know what you're reading and by inference, what you're thinking, who you're giving money to, what causes you support, et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't take much these days to have some, kind of low IQ spokesperson at the White House label you as an extremist. So this is all government's ever wanted, was total control of the people. It makes Louis XIV look like a very hands-off kind of guy.
But Jim, the government would never do these things. The tax office would never target a political group. They would never target a group of people because of donations to different causes. They would never target protesters in any way. They would never target someone who's doesn't want to get vaccinated in any way. None of these things would ever happen.
Well, I know you're being actually very serious, but I know that's more rhetorical. The fact is, not only will they happen, they have happened, they are happening. This is the world we live in. That's absolutely the case. And let me give some concrete examples, because I don't put stuff like that out there without backing up. So in 2010, the IRS targeted what we call in the United States the Tea Party movement. This was the first midterm of President Obama's first term in office. Historically, a time when the president's party loses a lot of seats. It's not even Democrats versus Republicans. It's just a consistent pattern of first term president, first midterm election, they lose seats. Obama lost almost a record number of seats, something like 63 or 64 seats versus an historical average closer to 30. Because of people were upset about Obamacare, they were upset about the tax increases, the bailouts coming out of the 2008 global financial crisis favored the rich, hurt the poor. There was just a lot of people were having second thoughts about voting for Obama in the first place. So we had this Tea Party movement, and they just kicked butt in the 2010 election. Well, so these were springing up everywhere. This was a genuine grassroots movement. There was no nationwide top-down organization. Communities were like, hey, let's start our own branch of the Tea Party, et cetera. And because they were They qualified as nonprofit organizations. There's some rules around that, but you have to apply to the IRS, our Internal Revenue Service, for a designation and a number proving that you're a nonprofit organization. Well, the person in charge of those was slow rolling all the applications. They weren't getting approved. They were entitled to it. That the IRS intervened to squash the formation of Tea Party movements from coast to coast for political reasons, plain and simple. Well, that was 12 years ago, and there was no central bank digital currency. Imagine how much more powerful that kind of corruption is today.
The everyday American has been 40 years at this point of being miseducated on the topic of gold. So they're not very much into gold. You go around the world, you get very different results. Switzerland, Germany, Austria, they love gold. Of course, China, Asian countries. I think Australians have a much better sense than Americans do. So there are the buyers of gold. But you say, well, okay, who are the big buyers of gold? The answer is the central banks. Now, right there, that should tell you something. So these are the most powerful, most plugged in, most heavily monetary institutions in the world. And they're the ones buying gold. Now, they would have you believe that gold's not money, gold serves no purpose. It's the first ones to say, John Maynard Keynes said it was a barbarous relic, which he never said, by the way. He said something. He used the phrase barbarous relic in reference to the gold exchange standard of the 1920s, which was a hybrid gold foreign currency standard, but the foreign currency is not gold. So he said that's a barbarous relic, but he never said that about gold himself. And actually, toward the end of his life, he favored, at Bretton Woods, he favored a global currency called the backward, backed by gold. And, it's not guesswork, they're papers he published at the time. And that was rejected by the United States, which kind of ran the show, partly because not to get too down on the weeds, but our Undersecretary of the Treasury, who was our representative at Bretton Woods, was a Stalinist agent. He was a communist. This didn't come out until the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, when a lot of classified information was released, all the KGB files, etc. But it was revealed and fully documented in a book by Ben Style called Battle of Bretton Woods, that he was a communist agent. So what was he trying to do by insisting that, by running Keynes's idea off the road, insisting that the US dollar be the anchor? He was trying to destroy the British Empire, which he did, because he knew that there were far more claims on the Bank of England than they had gold, and that would be inherently unstable, and that would derail sterling as one of the global reserve currencies and undermine the British Empire, which it did. So that's a little bit of a backstory, but it goes to the point that Keynes was an advocate for gold at different times in his career and at the end of his career, and that when the central banks are buying, I should tell you something. Now, I've said for years, I've always pointed to Russia and China. Russia has almost quadrupled their gold reserves in the last 12 years, starting in 2009 through 2021. They've almost quadrupled from about 600 tons to about 2,400 tons. China, the same, from about 600 tons to about just under 2,000 tons that they report, but they're non-transparent. They have a lot more gold than that stashed in something called SAFE, the State Administration on Foreign Exchange, which is a secretive Chinese sovereign wealth fund run by an ex-PIMCO guy, by the way. He knows what he's doing. And they're non-transparent. So the People's Bank of China is kind of transparent. SAFE is non-transparent. So every 6-7 years, what you'll see is the People's Bank of China will announce, well, we've increased our gold reserves by 400 tons or 500 tons or whatever, as the case may be. And well, it sounded like they went out the night before and bought 600 tons. Good luck trying that. You can't do it. Well, what it means is that SAFE took some of the hidden gold that they had been acquiring slowly and moved in an accounting entry, moved it over to the People's Bank of China, and boom, there's 500 tons overnight. But of course, they had it all along, and they still do. So they probably have more. So Russia and China are big acquirers, tripling and quadrupling their gold reserves. But now we're seeing it in a lot of other countries. The Philippines, Vietnam, Mexico, Iran is a major buyer, but non-transparent. Turkey has drastically increased its gold reserves. These are major countries, and they're adding. So I look at that, and there's very good data from the IMF and the World Gold Council, so you can find this information. But The one that was just like not doing anything was Japan. They had about 600 tons, but they had 600 tons for 30 years. And then just about, at this point, about 6 months ago, so late last summer, they bumped it by, I believe it was 50 tons, perhaps more. I look at the exact number, but it was over 50 tons overnight. It just went from, 600 tons to 650 tons, just like that. Well, here's what you know. Same thing I said about Russia. You can't buy 50 tons overnight, or you couldn't even do it in a month. I mean, the dealers would be working the order, it would be disruptive to the market. It would leave a lot of fingerprints, put it that way. But what it tells you is two things. Number one, Japan had the gold all along. They had it in some sidecar or side account or Ministry of Finance hidden account, as the case may be. And they chose to move it over to their reserve position, which they can do. That's an accounting entry, but they had to have had the gold all along, because you can't buy that much that fast. So then that begs the question, well, why all of a sudden? Why now, after decades of holding your gold level constant, you all of a sudden step up in a big way? A lot of possible answers to that. One, China's making noises about invading Taiwan. Well, if you're going to invade Taiwan, why not invade Japan while you're at it? It's just another chain of islands as far as the Chinese are concerned. And after this happened right around the time, maybe shortly after the U.S. debacle in Afghanistan, which was, the worst foreign policy, military disgrace, humiliation in U.S. history that I can remember. I don't know how far you have to go back to find a worse turn of events, and that there it was. Well, all of a sudden, allies all over the world, Israel, Japan, Taiwan, they're questioning the United States. Like, hey, we're under your nuclear umbrella. You stand by us through thick or thin. Here you leave Americans behind enemy lines. Perhaps, now this is speculation, but perhaps Japan sees the threat to Taiwan, feels they may be in the sights of the Chinese, feels the United States may not be as reliable as one had thought, and says, well, we now have to step up a little bit financially, militarily, et cetera. And they're doing that. But that aside, that's a little geopolitical speculation, but that aside, the gold is real. They put it on the books. So the biggest buyers of the gold in the world are the central banks. By the way, from 1970 to 2010, central banks were net sellers. Now, some bought and some sold, but on net, they were net sellers. We had Brown's bottom in 1999 when the UK sold half their gold at the lowest price in about 60 years. They literally hit the bottom at about $200 an ounce, give or take. But since 2010, central banks in the aggregate have been net buyers, and that buying is accelerating. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the most knowledgeable players in the world are adding gold to their reserves because they consider that a prudent hedge to the US dollar, if you have US dollar inflation, or to collapse of confidence in central bank currencies generally, or they're just saying, hey, we're part of the club. By the way, here's a good trivia question for you. If you're in a bar and with a lot of brainy economists around, ask them, bet them a drink on this. Ask them what percentage of U.S. reserves are in gold. And the answer in China is about 2%. Russia's about 20%. You know what the percentage is for the United States? 75%. The U.S. does not rely on euros and Aussie dollars and Canadian dollars for its reserve position. 75% of U.S. reserves are in gold. So don't let any central banker, don't let Jay Powell or Janet Yellen or any of these others tell you that gold's not a monetary asset. We have the largest gold stash in the world, and 75% of our reserves are in gold. So that's the U.S. As they say, watch what they do, not what they say. When people talk about the price of gold, people say, well, gold went up, and then they say gold went down. But gold really didn't do anything. Gold is an element. It's atomic number 79. It's a very nice, very attractive metal. What changed was the dollar price. So that's what people mean when they say gold went up. They mean the dollar price went up, and if they say gold went down, they mean the dollar price went down. But what does it really mean? Is that telling you something about gold, or is it telling you something about the currency? And I would say when the dollar price of gold goes down, that means the dollar got stronger. Each dollar buys you a little more gold. And when the dollar price of gold goes up, I would say the dollar got weaker because each dollar buys you a little less gold. When you translate it into weight, I always think about gold by weight. That's why I keep talking about tons and so forth, metric tons. So fluctuations in the dollar price of gold tell you more about dollars than they do about gold. It tells you about the strong dollar and the weak dollar. So as the dollar price of gold goes up, what it means is that the dollar is getting weaker. Now, so if you want to know the dollar price of gold, just do a long-term forecast on the currency, and you'll get to the dollar price of gold very quickly. So when you say, is gold a good asset? Is it a good diversifier? Is the price going up in the long run? Great questions. And the way I think about it is, well, what's going to happen to the dollar in the long run, up or down? Well, what's the history of all central bank currencies? What's the history of all fiat currencies? What's the history of inflation? They all go down over time, not all at once. And that's another source of confusion, because people look at, well, the dollar-euro cross rate, or they say euro to dollar cross rate, is the most heavily traded liquid, foreign exchange cross rate in the world by far. So, and in the past, say 2 months, euro has fallen from about $1.20 to today it's about $1.13. That's a significant decline in the value of the euro and a significant increase in the value of the dollar. So a lot of times when people say the dollar is stronger or weaker, they're actually not thinking about gold along the ways we just discussed. They're thinking about some dollar index. But if you peel back the layers of the onion for every index, Dow Jones, Bloomberg, Fed, it's all basically the euro-US dollar cross rate. So yeah, there's some Canadian, Australian, and yen and sterling. There's some other currencies in there, but the euro is the line of shears. All these indices are really euro-dollar cross rates. So when people say the dollar is stronger, well, it's another way of saying the euro is weaker. But currencies tend to trade within a range. They'll get here or they'll go here, but they're not like stocks. Major currencies, they don't go to zero. I mean, Zimbabwe, yeah, but the Australian dollar, euro, they're not going to zero. But they don't go to the moon the way Apple stock or Amazon does. They can be strong or weaker, but they tend to trade within a range, which makes them interesting to trade because you can spot those inflection points. So right now, when people talk about the strong dollar, they're really referring to the dollar value of a euro. But you could have a situation where gold is going much higher in dollar values, and that would be, as I said, a weak dollar. And yet the euro could be falling faster than the dollar. So people always look at the euro and they say strong dollar, weak dollar compared to the euro. My only advice is look at the dollar price of gold. Use that as your thermometer. A doctor walks into the room, they see the patient, they don't know anything. What's the first thing they do? They take their temperature. So if you want to take the dollar's temperature, look at the dollar price of gold.
I can tell you exactly what the Fed's going to do, and you can do this at home. So if listeners want to take notes, it's really easy. First of all, what is the problem the Fed's trying to solve? What is their solution? And then what are the exceptions to that so that we can have a complete predictive analytic model? The problem they're trying to solve is the following. We know from a long series of experiences, 30 or more business cycles since the end of World War II, that when the U.S. is in a recession, you have to cut interest rates 3 to 4% to get the U.S. out of a recession. You need 300 to 400 basis points of cuts to get the U.S. It's like a plane heading for the ground. How do you pull it out of a nosedive and get it back up in the sky? The answer is 300 basis points of cuts. How do you cut interest rates 300 basis points when you're only at 75 basis points? The answer is you can't. And forget about negative rates. The evidence is now pretty good that negative rates do not work. In other words, negative rates are not more of the same. When you go from, let's say, 0.5%, and you go to 1/4, and then you go to 0, and then you keep going to negative 25, you didn't just ease by another 25 basis points. The evidence from Japan and Europe is that you're through the looking glass and you have very strange effects, really unintended consequences. I'll give you a couple examples. So the conventional theory is, well, the more I cut interest rates, the more stimulus I get. That's a joke, but that's what they think. But if I go negative, you're absolutely going to go out and spend the money. Because if you don't spend the money, I'm going to take it away. You sit there long enough, you'll have nothing left in your bank account because I'm going to take, with these negative interest rates, I'm going to take it away. So people will run out and spend. And the other thing is that, it's obviously, from the lending point of view, they'll borrow money, because the bank pays you to be a borrower. But here's what happens in the real world. This is the difference between academics and human beings. When people see negative interest rates, people have goals in mind. They have lifetime goals, right? They want kids' education, parents' health care, their own health care, retirement. If you start taking their money away with negative rates, guess what they do? They save more. They're like, hey, I got to put my kids through college. You're taking my money. Well, I better save more. And then what kind of signal is the central bank sending with negative interest rates?
they're sending a deflationary signal. So people go, well, if you think it's going to be deflation, I'm not going to spend money. I'll wait till the price comes down. So you're trying to encourage lending and spending. And what you get is more savings and no spending, deferred spending. You get the exact opposite of what you want. So again, another egghead experiment gone awry. But the point being, so negative rates don't work. So zero bound really is zero. It really is a boundary. And Bernanke has said this in his recent writings, and I think he's right about that. So back to the problem. How do you cut interest rates 300 basis points when you're at 75? Well, the answer is you can't. So you have to raise them to 300 basis points. So the problem the Fed is trying to solve is how do they get rates to 3.25% before the next recession? Now, I'm not saying the Fed sees a recession, and that's easy because the Fed never sees a recession. In 102 years, the Fed has never seen a recession, never forecast a recession, but they know their economic history. We are 8 years into an expansion. It feels punk. I mean, the growth is anemic, but labor force participation is low, productivity is dropping. There are a lot of bad things going on, but in fact, we are in the 8th year, actually coming up on soon be entering the 9th year of an expansion, which began in June 2009. Right. By the way, you have a hard time convincing most Americans that we're not still in a recession. Depressions are different than recessions. The technical definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP with rising unemployment, a couple other bells and whistles, little subjective factors, but that's basically it. So people, when you say depression, they're like, depression sounds worse than a recession. And if recession is 2 quarters of declining GDP, then a depression must be like 10 quarters of declining GDP because it's got to be worse. But that's not the definition. The definition of a depression, you can have growth in a depression, but it's below trend growth. In other words, if trend is 3.5, and you're actually banging out 1.5, 2, that gap between, let's say, 1.5 and 3.5% growth, that's depressed growth. It's an output gap. It compounds over time, and you never get it back. We are losing trillions of dollars of wealth. We are impoverishing future generations on a relative basis because of our inability to get back to trend growth. So the reason American people feel this and don't listen to the economists, and they're right, is because we're in a depression. So leaving that aside, the Fed at least understands the business cycle and the fact that the next recession, they say they don't die of old age, but they do die, and we're getting close to the next one. So they're in a desperate race to get rates up to 3.5% before the next recession hits so they can cut them to get out of the recession. The question is, can you raise rates enough to cure the next recession without causing the recession you're preparing to cure? That's the dilemma. That's the finesse. My answer is no, they're not going to be able to do it, but they think they can. Why are they in this box? Well, because Bernanke should have raised rates in 2010, 2011, in the early stages of the expansion, when the economy would have been much better able to bear it than it is now. Bernanke skipped a whole cycle. He skipped a whole rate increase cycle to pursue these wacky experiments and, QE and zero interest rate policy and all that. I spoke to Bernanke about this, and he used the word experiment. He said this was an experiment. Bernanke made his academic reputation by studying the Great Depression, in the wake of Friedman and Anna Schwartz and some others. But he was a great scholar of the Great Depression, and he got his chance to kind of try out his theories. But what he told me was, he said 30 years from now, some new Ben Bernanke, some young scholar will look back and tell us if we did a good job or not. We actually don't know right now. See, the Great Depression was really 2 technical recessions, 29 to 33, and then 1937, 38. But from 33 to 37, we had an expansion, but the whole thing was a depression because we never got out of it. The stock market recovered the 1929 high in 1954. It was a long time to get back to even. But Bernanke's mantra was, doing something is better than doing nothing. I completely disagree. It's better to do nothing if you don't know what you're doing. And this is really the monetary equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath. Doctors say, first rule of being a doctor is first do no harm. Anyway, bottom line is, by pursuing QE and zero interest rate policy, Bernanke failed to raise rates during the early stages of a cyclical expansion, which he should have done. If he had, the economy would have been just fine, and we'd be able to cut them today, but he didn't. So Janet Yellen now has to make up for lost time. So that's the mission. But again, and this is what the market completely does not get. And the Wall Street economists don't get. Nobody gets this because they see the Fed raising rates. And they've done the correlations and the regressions back to World War II. And they go, every time the Fed raises rates, the economy is getting stronger. So if the Fed's raising rates, the economy must be getting stronger, so bid up stock prices, etc. But that's like saying umbrellas cause rain. Because they've got the causality backwards. The Fed never leads the economy, ever. The Fed follows the economy. So a normal business cycle looks like this. So you get a little expansion going and unemployment starts to go down, and industrial capacity utilization starts to go up, and inflation starts to go up, and the Fed's watching, and then it keeps going, and they go, oh, it's getting a little hot, we better raise rates, and they raise rates, but of course they started too late. The expansion keeps going, inflation keeps going up, unemployment keeps going down. Then the economy starts to cool down, unemployment goes up, and then prices go down, and capacity utilization drops, and we get into recession, like, we better cut. And then they cut, and then you hit the bottom, and then you come out of it again. So think of that as like a nice, pretty sine wave, right? That's a business expansion, business contraction over and over, 30 or so times since the end of World War II, with the Fed always following the economy, never leading the economy. So all the big brands on Wall Street, they've got all this data, and they say, well, every time the Fed raises rates, the economy is getting stronger. That has absolutely been true for like 30 times since the end of World War II. It is not true today. The reason it's not true today is because Bernanke skipped a cycle and they're playing catch up. For the first time since 1937, the Fed is tightening into weakness. That is a key thing to bear in mind. The Fed is tightening into weakness. They are not leading the economy to strength. They are not responding to strength, even though Wall Street thinks they are. And there's a great danger that they're actually going to cause the recession they're preparing to cure, as I mentioned. The Fed will raise rates 25 basis points 4 times a year from now until the middle of 2019, until they get them to 3.25%. So like clockwork, every March, June, September, December, for 2017, 2018, into 2019, look for a Fed rate hike until they get to 3.25%, at which point they'll be able to say, all right, now we're at 3.25. If we have a recession tomorrow, we can cut them back down to 0 again and get out of it. That'll be mission accomplished. Now, this is why I was sitting there in December like, yep, they're going to raise them in March. And right now, I'll tell your listeners they're going to raise them in June. There's your Fed response function. There's your baseline scenario. What are the exceptions to a Fed rate hike? Under what conditions will they not raise rates? Because everything I just described to you, they've had in mind since March 2015 when Yellen took patience out of the statement. That was the end of forward guidance. And by the way, if you go back to 2015, I said they're not going to raise rates all year, and they weren't going to do the liftoff that people were looking for in March, June, September, and they didn't lift off in September because the Chinese rate exchange devaluation, the stock market fell out of bed August 2015. Finally, they raised them in December 2015, and Wall Street was ready for March. I said, no, in June, no, September, no. It wasn't until December 2016 that they raised them the second time. So obviously, there are conditions under which they don't raise rates, notwithstanding the baseline scenario. So what are those conditions? There are 3. Well, 4 actually. So if you see job creation below 75,000, that will cause them to pause. By the way, pause is the key word. If you go home through the speeches, you'll see the word pause in Dudley's recent remarks. Pause is the Fed's jargon for we're not going to raise rates. We got the Jim scenario, which I took from the Fed. It's their scenario, or a technical recession. So, we're going to know Friday what the first quarter GDP is. It's pretty close to negative, but I'm not saying we're in a recession now. We might be. But if you see a recession, they'll pause. See job creation below 75,000, they'll pause. By the way, that's a very low bar. If you see a jobs report, see, this is the other thing that confuses Wall Street. You see a jobs report with 100,000 jobs. So Wall Street goes, oh, that report's really weak. The Fed's going to think twice. No, 75,000 is the number. Yellen told us that. It was in one of her speeches. You just have to be a geek like me and read all the speeches. So the third factor would be disinflation. So the Fed has this 2% inflation target. They missed it for 6 years. They're finally getting close to hitting it. By the way, I think the listeners know they use the PCE core deflator year over year. There's PPI and CPI and core, a bunch of inflation indices, but we know what they use. PCE core deflator year over year. That actually has been getting close to 2%. But if you see it turn around, if you see that gap down to like 1.5, 1.4, 1.3, then they will pause. The last condition for the pause is a disorderly decline in stock markets more than 5%. If you see a 6, 7, 8% decline, so if the S&P went down 100 points, Fed doesn't care. Dow Jones goes down 1,000 points, Fed doesn't care. But beyond that, if you see the S&P start to go down 150 or the Dow start to go down 1,500 points in a disorderly way, it looks a little scary. It looks like there's no bottom. It looks like if you see that, they'll pause. So the Fed's going to raise like clockwork 4 times a year for the next 2.5 years, unless you see job creation below 75,000, disinflation, a technical recession. If you don't see one of those things, they're going to raise rates. And so right now, I don't see any of them. I mean, they could all happen, but it looks like, growth is going to be positive. Job creation's been decent, over 100,000. Disinflation is probably coming, but not quite here yet. And they'll want to see a couple months in a row. And the stock market's not crashing. So none of the pause conditions are in place. Therefore, they will raise rates. Simple.
What the FDIC did on Friday was actually consistent with what they all said they were going to do in 2014. It was a bail-in. And if you had $1 billion deposit, you're going to contribute to the rescue. Within 48 hours, they did a 180-degree turn. They completely blew away the $250,000 insurance limit. They said, we're guaranteeing all the deposits, multi-billion-dollar deposits. By the way, a dirty little secret about what happened at the White House. I said that, the Silicon Valley billionaires were all crying about all these little startups and all this stuff. The truth is, a lot of what Silicon Valley Bank was financing was green technology, but they were in the White House sweet spot by saying green, and they were. That was actually what they were financing. Everyone thinks, oh, somebody's working on an app. They weren't apps. They was like battery power. So they get bailed out. At the same time, on Sunday night, now we're talking March 12th, they closed another bank, which was Signature Bank. Something about S, Silvergate, Silicon, Signature, all the S's were going down. Now, Signature Bank was another interesting case, which was Barney Frank was on the board of Signature. And if that name rings a bell, just think of Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank, 2010, 1,000-page legislation. I know I met Barney. I know Chris Dodd very well. That was supposed to solve all the problems of the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, et cetera. Here, the author of the bailout legislation is on the board of the bank, and his bank gets shut down. Well, what's up with that? They bought government bonds. And when interest rates went up from 10-year note, treasury note yield to maturity went from 1 3/4 to 4, all those bonds lost 80% of the value. That's what happens on long duration bonds. Bond math is simple: rates up, price down, vice versa. Well, the rates were up, the price was down. So they were underwater and insolvent, and they got shut down. So Barney Frank's out whining the next day. He's like, hey, yeah, but that's true of every bank in the country. There's not a bank out there that didn't load up on treasury bonds at 1 3/4. They're all underwater. They're all insolvent. And by the way, the Fed announced a facility, but basically what they said was, if you're a member bank and you have treasury securities that are where the mark-to-market value is below par, so you paid 10 million, but they're only worth 8 million. And that was the case across the board. So they get trillion dollars or more of bonds that were in that category. You can deliver them to us, and we will lend you for 1 year the face value. So you're putting up 80 cents of collateral, but you're getting a 100-cent loan. I said, I got a 15-year-old car. Will you lend me what I paid for it? Because it's a lot more than it's worth now. But that's what they did. So now my head's spinning. I'm like, well, I get all this stuff, but I'm like, oh, so you just guaranteed every deposit in the banking system without limit, and you just guaranteed every treasury bond at par value without limit. What's left? What else do you have in your bag of tricks? Because you don't have it. There's nothing else you can do. Go back to 2008, they guaranteed every money market fund in the country. So, but here's Barney Frank whining, hey, yeah, my bank was in trouble, but so was every bank in the country. Why did you whack me and give all these guys a pass? Well, the answer is Signature Bank was another crypto bank. It had a portal called Signet. And Signet was a portal to the crypto world. And that's why they whacked it. Notice they whacked 2 crypto banks. Everyone's asking Janet Yellen, it's like, wait a second, what just happened? You guaranteed every deposit in the banking system. And she's like, well, no, not really. It's only if you're systemically important. And you're like, okay, could you please define systemically important so we can tell? Because we're getting our money out of all the banks that are not. And the truth is you can't, because the system is so densely interconnected. And this is why they say financial contagion. I mean, it's a metaphor, but the mathematics of a viral spread. We just went through a pandemic, but this has been true, for as long as it's been studied. The mathematics of viral contagion are identical to the mathematics of financial contagion. The equations are the same, the way it spreads. And of course, Janet Yellen can't define systemically important. Number one, they try, but they can't. Number two, I don't care how small you are. If you're a small bank and there's a run, the guy across the street, he's getting his money out of that bank. And again, it's like COVID. It's like it just keeps going until the system collapses, which means by definition, just by the dynamics, there's no such thing as a bank that's not systemically important because they're all connected. Even the little banks are borrowing from the big banks, et cetera. So Janet Yellen hemmed and hawed and didn't have a good answer. She never does. She's not that bright. And so there we are. So the Fed has guaranteed every bond at par value, even if you're worth 20% less. And the FDIC has guaranteed every deposit. And Janet Yellen can't give you a good definition of what's covered and what isn't. Okay. Now a week goes by. What's on tap for the next week? And again, Friday night press release, shotgun wedding, Credit Suisse and UBS. Now you're talking to big guys. These are two of the biggest, oldest banks in the world. I think Credit Suisse have been around since the 1870s, maybe, and I'm not sure about UBS, but they were the two biggest banks in Switzerland. So Credit Suisse fails, and they get taken over by UBS. Okay, and now everyone's like, oh, what's next? Who's next? And there's a list. I'll go through it in a minute. What factors come into play? How can I think about whether a bank is likely to fail or not, regardless of whether they're getting bailed out? And there are two metrics that are really good. One is look at the ratio of uninsured deposits to total deposits. If that number is more than 30%, you're a sitting duck. And in Silicon Valley's case, it was 97%. They were 97% uninsured. So a little local bank that's got, I'll say 30% uninsured and 70% insured, they're very unlikely to have a bank run. Most of those customers are like, hey, I'm covered, I'm good, I got 100,000 in the bank, all good. But when you're up the, north of 30, certainly north of 50, 70, 80, 90, you're an accident waiting to happen. Yeah. The other metric is total assets. So there really are too big to fail banks. Doesn't mean they can't fail, but it means they're 100% guaranteed to get bailed out. And that list is well known. So who's too big to fail? Like you can put your money in, they can screw up really badly, and you're not going to get hurt as a depositor. JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Goldman, the usual suspects, Goldman Sachs, US Bancorp, Capital One, TD, State Street, Citi, B of A, Morgan Stanley, PNC Financial, Bank of New York Mellon, Truist Financial, and BMO Harris. They're the giants, okay?
Right.
I'm not saying they can't fail. I'm saying that there'll be a safety net put under them, and no one's going to lose anything except maybe stockholders, but not bondholders, not depositors. But a global recession is highly unusual, and that appears to be what we're heading for. So my forecast, I do update them, but big picture, it goes as follows. So what is Jay Powell doing? First of all, March 1st, 2022, the Fed fund policy rate, interest rates were zero. And we're now at 4.5%. Even in the Volcker days, we never went up 4.5% in 10 months. Not that fast. And so here we are. So what is Powell doing? Well, he's given 5 speeches on the subject. I don't know why Wall Street doesn't listen, but he keeps trying. He said the same thing every time. He said, inflation is job one. We're just going after inflation. Believe us. There is going to be a recession. Unemployment is going to go up. There's going to be pain. I've never heard a Fed chairman use the word pain. He used it 5 times in one paragraph in the Jackson Hole speech. And that's what we're doing. And believe us when we say it. Now, how long will he raise rates? How quickly? And what's he trying to do? Powell is trying to get to something that he calls the terminal rate. The definition of the terminal rate is it's a rate that's high enough to cause inflation to come down on its own without further hikes. So we'll get to a level, and then inflation is coming down, by the way. And in the last 5 months, in the U.S., it's gone from about 9% to 8.7, 8.2, 7.4, 7.1. So it is coming down. Having said that, the target is 2%. and 7.1 is still a far cry from 2. So he's not there, but he's making progress. Now, so here's I hate to use the word conundrum, but it kind of is. Wall Street's saying, you're done. You did it. Mission accomplished. Inflation is coming down. You got what you wanted. Give it time. Stop raising rates. You're going to kill the economy. But the Fed is saying, well, we actually don't know. We can't untangle it. Yes, inflation is coming down. That's objective. But is it coming down because we're still raising rates? Or is it coming down because we're at the terminal rate? Those are two different things. And right now, and this is what Powell's been saying, the Fed leans to the view that they're not at the terminal rate, that inflation is coming down because they're raising rates. They have not achieved the terminal rate. So my expectation is the Fed will raise interest rates 50 basis points on February 1st, and then probably 25 basis points in March. March 22nd is the Fed meeting after that. So those 75 plus the 450 we have now, that'll get you to 5.25. And even the more hawkish members think that that's probably the terminal rate. So, so Powell and the Fed have said, yeah, inflation's coming down, but it's because we're raising rates, not because we're at the terminal rate. We're going to get to the terminal rate, probably 2 more hikes, and then we'll pause. And then if we're right, we'll just let inflation come down on its own. And that may take a year. So all this stuff about the Fed pivot and cutting rates and all that stuff, I mean, the Fed's thinking mid 2024 before they do that. Now, Wall Street are saying, no, you're not going to get that far. You may be at the terminal rate already. You're definitely going to cause a recession. It'll be more severe than you think. And rates are going to have to come down sooner than people expect. In other words, you've already achieved the terminal rate. You just don't know it. And you'll probably be the last to know. So with Wall Street, with the cheerleaders, sending that message, but with some serious market indicators, including yield curves, sending that message, why is Powell sticking to the game plan as I described it? And the answer goes back to 1980, believe it or not, and what's called the Volcker mistake. People forget that there was a recession in 1980. It was sharp but quick. It was over very quickly. It had nothing to do with monetary policy. The Carter administration issued some dopey regulation on a ceiling on credit card interest rates. And the industry said, fine, we're just not going to lend anybody any money. The economy fell instantly, kind of like a smaller version of what happened in 2020 with the pandemic panic. And then they said, oh, sorry, just kidding. And then they took the ceiling off and then things got back to normal. Now, this was a time when farmers around the country were driving front loaders and tractors to Washington, and they were circling the Fed building. And one guy drove his tractor up the steps of the Fed, and Volcker was being burned in effigy. That all happened. So it was a little bit of pressure. And of course, Congress was up in arms and the White House was up in arms. So Volcker, not quite panicked, but he cut interest rates 7 percentage points, not 0.7, 7 full percentage points to deal with the recession, which, number one, was unnecessary because the recession was caused by a policy blunder from the White House, which was quickly corrected. And number two, he had not won the fight against inflation. Well, after he cut rates and we came out of that very quick sort of snap recession, inflation got even worse. And that's when Volcker had to raise rates to 20%. And Volcker, in hindsight, and he said this in his last book just before he died, he said, we shouldn't have done that. We should have stuck to our inflation mission. So now Powell, remember, Powell's not an economist. He's a lawyer. So he kind of thinks like a lawyer. I can relate to that, looking at both sides. Powell does not want to be that guy. He does not want to be the guy who balks early and cuts rates, the famous Wall Street pivot, before the battle against inflation is won, because the outcome could be exactly what Volcker experienced, which is inflation wasn't done, doesn't go away, comes back stronger, and then you do have to destroy the economy, as we did in 1981-82. That was the worst recession. That was far worse than the little one in 1980. That was the worst since the Great Depression. We've managed to break that record several times since then, but at the time that was horrific. But Volcker and others have said that was a blunder he never should have done. So Powell does not want to give up the rate hikes too early because he does not want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He does not want to be that guy. And that's what's driving him, even as Wall Street screams, you're already there. So the question is, that's the lay of the land. There's the two competing sides. How does this play out? In my view, Powell probably is there. He probably is at something like a terminal rate. He probably doesn't have to raise interest rates anymore. He doesn't believe that himself. His models tell him otherwise because they're relying on the Phillips curve, which is junk science. I mean, the last time I looked at a Phillips curve, it was flat. At least where I went to school, curve was curved. This thing is flat. There is no correlation between unemployment and inflation. There just isn't. But the Fed thinks there is. So I always tell people, don't. If you want to forecast Fed policy and understand the Fed, don't think like a rational person. You have to think like the Fed, because you have to get inside their heads or else you're going to get it wrong. So they're looking at unemployment, which is the lowest. The unemployment rate is the lowest since 1969. Well, if you believe in the Phillips curve, then that's a sure sign of inflation. As I say, even though it's coming down, it's still pretty high. So they think they have to keep fighting this fight. But here's what they're missing. Here's where it all falls down. Yeah, inflation as measured, CPI, PPI, personal consumption expenditure, core, non-core, year over year. There are like 20 different ways to measure it. It is coming down, but there are two sources of inflation. And it's going to sound obvious, but you got to separate them: the supply side and the demand side. They both result in price increases, but they have completely different dynamics. Supply side inflation is what we're seeing. It's what we saw in 1974 with the Arab oil embargo during the Arab-Israeli war when they cut us off from oil. And, you had to line up for gasoline. I lived through that. Bare shelves, and you couldn't get certain things. It wasn't that every supermarket shelf was bare the way it was in East Germany in the 1950s, but something was always missing. And that's still the case today. So, of course, prices went up, and people were trying to pay whatever they had to get what they needed, and energy prices were a big driver of that. So that feeds through as a form of inflation. The other kind of inflation is from the demand side. So the supply side is called cost push. Costs go up, and they push it onto the consumers. The other kind is from the demand side. It's called demand pull. And basically, consumers have a change in mentality. They're worried about inflation. They would say, hey, I was thinking about buying a refrigerator. Gee, I better go buy it today, because if I wait for 6 months, the price is going to go up. Or apply that to anything, a new dress, new suit of clothes, whatever. And so you're pulling demand forward, and it's behavioral. And that will also drive prices up. But they're very different things. Now, cost push can morph into demand pull. That's what happened in the 70s. It started from the supply side, but by the late 70s, 80s, and Volcker, which we've just been talking about, it had tipped over into the demand side. That hasn't happened yet. We've had the supply side inflation, the cost push. It hasn't yet tipped into demand pull. It hasn't really affected consumer behavior that much in terms of people anticipating more inflation. It could, but it hasn't happened yet. Here's why that's an important distinction. Cost push inflation negates itself. The old saying that the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices, because people can't afford it. Maybe if demand is inelastic, you've got to fill up your Ford F-150 truck with gasoline to take the kids to school or go to work. But if you're unemployed, you're not buying any gas because you're not leaving the house. So it tends to negate itself, whereas demand pull feeds on itself. Powell has not made that distinction. And if I'm right, I think I am right, and the evidence backs that up, this inflation will come down, not because the Fed is raising interest rates, but because higher prices destroy demand all on their own. If I used to pay $75 to fill up my truck with gas, and now I have to pay $150, which is about right, I'll do it because I got to get to work. But that's $75 I'm not going to spend on something else. I'm not going to go out for dinner. I'm not going to go to a show, a concert, or buy a new camera, whatever it might be. So it does tend to depress demand, destroy demand, and hurt the economy. And then it slows down, and then the inflation comes down on its own. That appears to be happening. But Powell hasn't really made the distinction. He's fighting the last war. I hate to use a cliche, but he's fighting the Volcker War. And what he's got looks a little bit more like the Herbert Hoover War. That looks a little bit more like the 1930s than the 1970s. So the bottom line on all this is the Fed is going to raise rates at least twice more for the reasons I mentioned. Powell doesn't want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He thinks the battle's not won. He has to get to the terminal rate. In reality, he's probably already there, if there is such a thing as a terminal rate. It's another one of these things they made up. Inflation is coming down, and so will probably continue, but for really bad reasons. But the Fed has a hidden asset.
What is the hidden asset? And how do you make millions from it? According to Jim Rickards, the Fed has a hidden asset called gold certificate. It's something that the Fed can and will use in times of emergency when we return to the gold standard. How and when the Fed will use it? Well, they'll use it to back the dollar when the dollar collapses and people no longer trust it. The Fed needs thousands of tons of gold, so they'll buy it from the public. So, what is exactly this gold certificate? Let's hear more from Jim Rickards.
If you go again to go to the balance sheet, go to the asset side, the first line item, there's something called gold certificate. And what is that? Well, in 1934, the U.S. Treasury confiscated the Fed's gold. They had already taken the gold from the U.S. citizens by that point, but they wanted it all, and so they took the Fed's gold. But under the but again, bear in mind the Fed's privately owned. So under the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, it is illegal, it's unconstitutional to seize property without paying just compensation. You can do it, but you got to pay the person, and then people get into all kinds of arguments about what it's actually worth. So what just compensation did the Treasury give to the Fed when they took the Fed's gold in 1934? The answer is they gave them a gold certificate. It can be, you can calculate it. In other words, you can say, well, what is the amount of gold by weight, not by dollar value, but by weight that is needed to back up that certificate given the historic cost? Well, the answer is about 8,000 tons. Guess how much gold the Treasury has? About 8,000 tons. I mean, one of the reasons I've hypothesized that the Treasury stopped selling gold in 1980 because they lost gold to trading partners between 1950 and 1970. They lost 11,000 tons. They went from 20 to 9, but they sold another 1,000 tons in the 1970s to suppress the price of gold, which failed because it always does. But by 1980, they had were down to 8,000 tons, and they stopped. Why did the U.S. stop selling gold? We've never sold any significant amount of gold since. The answer is, in my view, is that they can't go below that because that's the amount of gold the Treasury needs to back up this gold certificate on the Fed's books. So, okay, just kind of put that into one side. That asset is valued on the Fed's balance sheet at $42.22 an ounce. The price of gold, look today, it was about $1,850 an ounce. Now, so, what's, as I say, sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If we're going to mark the mortgages to market in a world where interest rates have gone up and the mortgages have gone down, it's only fair to mark the gold to market. And if you mark that gold to market at $1,850 an ounce versus $42, voila, you would find that the Fed has another approximately $350 billion of hidden assets. So I think that takes care of the solvency problem. So before we beat up the Fed on mark to market on mortgages, that's fine. But have a look at the gold and realize that they have a hidden asset, a shadow asset on their books that's worth in the hundreds of billions of dollars.
We've heard from Jim that the Fed has hundreds of billions of dollars of a hidden asset, and that hidden asset is a gold certificate held by the Fed and backed up by real gold in the U.S. Treasury. When the time comes, the Fed will definitely use it to back the new dollar. They'll even buy more gold from the public, and therefore the price will go up significantly. But how much exactly is the price of gold will go up? Is it a big deal?
I think it would be a very big deal. But it begs the question, if you're going to revalue it, to what level do you revalue it? So everyone said, well, the market's 1850, that's about where it is today. It goes up and down, but revalue it at 1850. That could be highly deflationary. And the reason is, in effect, you're putting yourself on a gold standard. You don't have to. That's why they won't do it. They don't want to touch it. But if you did, you would be saying, hey, gold's really worth 1850 and we have this much gold, et cetera. But at that point, analysts would sort of turn and say, well, okay, well, you're back to a kind of gold standard. What's the relationship between gold and money or currency or US dollars and others, the money supply? But what is the relationship between gold and money supply? What you would find is that at 1850, the gold relative to the money supply is about 2%. Whereas historic gold standards were run with somewhere between 20 and 40%. Bank of England in the 19th century managed a successful gold standard between the Congress of Vienna and World War I with about 20% gold. In the US, through most of the 20th century, at least the first half, ran a gold standard with about 40% backing. It was actually the law. The law until the late 1960s, I think 1968, was that the Fed money supply, base money, could not be more than 2.5 times the value of gold. Originally at $20 an ounce, $20.67 an ounce, later $35 an ounce. But whatever that number was, times the amount of gold, that had to be 40% of the money supply, and the money supply could not be greater than that. And then they got rid of that in 1968 because of the war in Vietnam. But the point being, 20% has worked, 40% definitely works. The Austrians like to bang the table and insist on 100%, but maybe, but that's historically not been required. You just need enough gold to be able to give gold to people who want it when they want it. And if you're credible in that dimension, most people are content to hold the money. So as a hypothetical, you can say, well, okay, let's say we want a gold standard, and let's say that we want 40% backing of M1. M2 is a bigger number, or at least it can be. Let's just say, so 40% backing of M1, that's a conservative kind of gold standard, not extreme, but reasonable.
From February to March 2020, the Fed has printed $2 trillion. The impact of that is our money supply goes up, and so does our inflation. With massive price increases in food and energy, gold prices would have to rise too, right? And if the Fed uses 40% gold backing to back the new dollar, and with the current high inflation that we have, what would the price of gold be? Jim Rickards gives a staggering gold price prediction. Let's listen to Jim.
What would given the amount of gold the United States has, what would the price of gold have to be in order to maintain that ratio? The answer is about $15,000 an ounce. And people say, well, Jim, you used to say $10,000 an ounce. Well, that's true, because it was true at the time. But when you expand the money supply, the number goes up, right? Because the amount of gold is fixed. So it was 10,000 not that many years ago, and today it's 15,000. Well, if you say gold's worth 1,800, people are going to say, well, give me the gold. I'll take all the gold you got at that price. And then they're going to have to shut the gold window again, and that has its own problems. But in other words, it's not clear how it would work. I mean, there are a lot of ways it could work mechanically. It's not clear what the government would actually do. But my point is, if you try to mark gold to market on the Fed's balance sheet, you're opening Pandora's box. Because you would be getting a lot of people, bankers, analysts, Wall Streeters, investors, to sit up and take notice and say, well, hey, what is going on here? You're back in the gold business. Well, you got the price wrong, because you can't back up your money supply at that level. And the truth is, you can't. The debt's not going up at 2% or 3%. The debt's going up 8, 9, 10% or more. The U.S. had a $1 trillion baseline budget deficit, $1 trillion per year deficit for fiscal 2020 pre-pandemic. The Congress threw $3 trillion of emergency aid on top of that. And I'm not even criticizing all those programs. I mean, the payroll protection plan loans, the extended unemployment benefits, the increased unemployment benefits. Imagine where we'd be if we hadn't done that. But that aside, debt is debt. They piled $3 trillion on top. Now, this is going to take the U.S. debt to GDP ratio up to 135%. It was 106% when Donald Trump was sworn in. It's close to 130% today. Because remember, you got two things going on. It's a debt to GDP. So debt's your numerator and GDP is your denominator, right? Well, what happened? Well, the denominator shrank. This got smaller and this got bigger. So what happens to the ratio? It blows up. So now it's 135%. If you get the laws of economics right, which is not easy because most economists don't, but if you get them right, it's really a reflection of human nature. I mean, what is an economy other than all the people in the economy starting businesses, buying, selling, traveling, providing goods and services, et cetera. So human nature doesn't change, or at least it hasn't changed much in the last 100,000 years. So the fundamental laws of economics don't change either, but circumstances change, facts change, and that's important. Now, to answer your question, Kerry, you're right. There is a school of thought, a growing one, an influential one, that the debt doesn't matter. It's like, well, wait a second. So what? So the debt to GDP ratio went to 135%, which it did.
Who cares? Well, what's wrong with it? 180%. We got issues. We got problems. Print up the money and monetize the debt and spend it and keep going. What is the problem? This comes under the banner of something called modern monetary theory, MMT. It's flawed. It's wrong, but it's got its followers, and those followers are now in the White House because one of the things Joe Biden had to do to get elected was to make peace with the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. They take the view that if the Treasury didn't spend the money, how would anybody make any money? That's ridiculous, but that's what they say. They say, hey, when the Treasury spends money, what do? Well, they build aircraft. They have benefit programs. They have government contracts. They do whatever they do. But when the Treasury gives you the money, you take the money and you spend it on somebody else, goods and services, go out to dinner, have subcontractors, whatever it might be. That's the real source of money. They also take the Treasury and the Fed and they merge them. Now, that's not legally the case. The Treasury and the Fed are separate institutions. The Treasury is just part of the executive branch, and the Fed is an independent agency. And the Federal Reserve banks are actually privately owned. That a lot of people know. Some people know that, some people don't. But the Federal Reserve banks are privately owned by banks in the districts, so Citibank, Bank of America, et cetera. So they're completely separate. But the theorists ignore that and say, no, the Treasury needs to spend money because that's how the economy grows. And the Fed can monetize the debt. So you spend the money you don't have, you borrow to cover it, you issue bonds to cover the borrowing. And if the market wants to buy the bonds, fine. But if not, the Fed can buy them and put them away on the balance sheet, wait 30 years and collect the money. What's the problem? Who cares about the debt to GDP ratio? It's kind of a statistical abstract, but why should that stand in the way of using money to solve our problems, which are free healthcare, free childcare, free tuition, forgiveness of student loans? That's a $1.6 trillion ticket, by the way. And look, everyday readers and investors, there's no reason they should know all this stuff. This is total inside baseball. You have to be a geek like me to kind of keep up with it, but it's all coming. But what that means is we're going to test the Rogoff-Reinhardt thesis. Now, let me just take a minute to explain that. Up to a certain debt to GDP ratio, there is a Keynesian multiplier greater than 1. So the classic example is the UK was in a depression before the rest of the world. They have been hit pretty hard before the Wall Street crash. People aren't spending, they're saving. It's the liquidity trap. So if you get money, you pay down debt. When you don't have any debt, you put it in the bank. Whatever you do, you don't spend it. You hoard cash. Or people were buying gold. They were accused of hoarding gold, et cetera. But what they weren't doing was spending. And there was a lack of aggregate demand, and the banks were not lending. So Keynes said, well, if everyday people won't do it, the government must. The government can borrow. The government can spend. And what they discovered was that if you borrow $1 and spend $1, you can get $1.50 of GDP. Now, there's a separate debate as to whether that's actually incremental or whether you're just pulling growth forward. But so what? Even if you are pulling growth forward, maybe that's what you need to do when you're in a liquidity trap. But there's a problem. He called it the general theory of employment, interest, and money. But it was actually a special theory. I think he had a little Einstein in me because of the general theory of relativity. But it's actually a special theory, which means it's a theory that works in a set of circumstances, a set of conditions. The conditions where it works are you're either in a recession or just coming out of one. You have excess capacity in labor and industrial capacity, and you have very little debt. In those circumstances, you can borrow $1, spend $1, and get more than $1 GDP. The problem is that extra GDP you get for the borrow and spend, it goes down as the debt to GDP ratio goes up. What Reinhardt and Rogoff discovered is that at 90%, you go through the looking glass. Your payoff is now less than $1. You borrow $1, you spend $1, and you only get 90 cents of GDP or 95 cents, et cetera. So now, not only are you not getting your dollar's worth for the borrowed dollar or something more, which you did at lower levels, you're getting less than $1. So now what's happening? You're borrowing $1, you're spending $1, you're not getting $1 of GDP.
but you are getting $1 of debt, which means your debt to GDP ratio is going up, and the 90% is getting worse. And I just mentioned the United States is at 135%. So here are your two competing schools. There's the Keynesian multiplier and creating aggregate demand with government debt, and the Reinhardt-Rogoff, more than a thesis, I would say powerful evidence that beyond 90%, it doesn't work. It goes under less than 1 on the one hand. And my friend Stephanie Kelton and Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris and the modern monetary theorists who say, no, it's all good. How could you get growth if you didn't spend money through the government? These theories don't agree at all. We're going to find out which ones work. I'll give away the answer, which is that Reinhardt and Rogoff have it right. Keynes had it right up to a point. Reinhardt and Rogoff discovered that critical threshold, that whether you want to call it tipping point or phase transition, or which physicists call it or whatever. The modern monetary theorists think the opposite, and we're going to find out. But what it means if Reinhardt and Rogoff are right, and I'm right, and Keynes was right, the more you borrow, it's actually a headwind to growth. Now you get just as up to the threshold, you got more and more and more. At a low level, you got more, but then it went down. But it's like any diminishing marginal return. You know, the curve starts very steeply, you get a lot of payoff, then it flattens out, then it goes down, but it's still positive. But at some point, it goes below the zero line and your marginal return is negative. And that's where we are.